recording. We're recording this session. And the last thing is to please be respectful and kind throughout the session. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Steve Todesco. Steve is a retired actuary, a full-time regenerative farmer at Coyote Hollow Farms, and Transition Guelph's board chair. He and his wife Marie gave up corporate urban life and have been practicing ecological farming near Guelph Lake for 10 years. Steve's career as an actuary, evaluating risk, plus his insatiable curiosity about how the world works, has led to over 30 years of study on the interplay of the environment, the economy, and energy. All three are inextricably linked and in accelerating decline. Fortunately, there are many imaginative minds working on how we manage our collective predicament and offer hope for a better and different future. So there was a lot of big words in there. Hopefully that came out clear. And now it's over to you, Steve.
Thanks so much, Kirsten, and welcome everybody. I'm so excited about all the names that I've seen pop up. A lot of folks that are near and dear to my heart, and some associates that I have a lot of appreciation for. So before we start, I want to say a big thank you to Kirsten and CJ. They've done a ton of work on this festival to organize it and get all of the virtual pieces up and running. And I can't tell you just how proud I am of what they've done. And I think it's really pushed the organization into a new and exciting place. So I appreciate that very much. And you'll see the dedication at the bottom of the screen. And also I want to do a shout out to my harsh critics, Christine, Marie, and Sally, who went through this presentation, gave tons of great suggestions. So thanks, guys. I really appreciate it. All right. So I'm going to start out here. The first half hour is going to be fairly heavy stuff, and it's difficult and disturbing things that and times that we're going into. I don't take a lot of pleasure in talking about this because it's huge change that we're faced with and a lot of risks. But as John F. Kennedy says, I'm the type of person I'd rather know what's coming at me and do something about it. And so it's with hope and a positive view of the world that I take this information. Hopefully you will too. Oops, sorry. So this presentation really is for everybody. It's for the first half, so hang in there.
Steve, sorry to interrupt.
Best. Yes.
I would just like to ask everyone to turn their video off just to increase bandwidth, because I noticed there's a small lag. So other than you, Steve, I would ask all the participants if they can turn their video off. Thanks. Sorry, please continue.
Yeah, thanks, Kirsten. Okay, it's also, my presentation is done in good faith. I really care about the community, and I do this with some humility, and you'll see a lot of what I talk about is actually based on a ton of really smart people. I kind of view one of my strengths as synthesizing complex things and then hopefully turning it into something that's digestible. And keep your mind open, and please also have a kind heart. In times of change like this, those two are really key. And oftentimes Transition Guelph will put some suggestions out into the community, and we realize that some of these things might be out of the reach of some of our community members. Please don't take any offense with that. Anybody in the community who takes some of these steps strengthens the entire community, and we all benefit. And so we put this out there for the benefit of the community. The festival's been structured around a lot of the elements of this presentation and what we're facing. So take advantage of the events that are coming up. And then the classic disclaimer at the bottom. Anything they say is not to be construed as financial advice. I hate that I have to say that, but okay, so I've already alluded to the fact that there's a ton of smart people out there that have seen the dark clouds gathering on the horizon for a long time. And in my 30 years, I've landed on some folks that I consider kind of my core go-to resources for that kind of information. I'm not going to go through this list, but I think we'll try to post this presentation online afterwards so you can go back to reference it. But yeah, there's some really good stuff out there and very helpful, courageous people, really. Okay, so before I get into the presentation, there's a few core concepts and definitions that I wanted to touch on. Oh. So the first one is the predicament. We've grown up in a society the last 100 years where we've practically solved everything that's been a challenge ahead of us. And so we're a culture of problem solvers, and everything we look at is a problem. But we're in a situation now where there's really not a problem, it's a predicament. And predicament's not to be solved, it's something you have to manage. And that's hard for us because we're so adept at technological breakthroughs and throwing cheap energy at problems and doing just miraculous things. But I think we're now in a situation where we just can't solve it. We have to figure out how to manage through it. The other question that comes up, especially with transition work, we talk about resilience all the time. And some people think of the classic engineering definition of resilience, which means the ability of something to have an impact of some negative impact and then be able to bounce back to exactly its same shape and form. We're not talking about that here. We believe we are going to evolve through this, and it's really about adaptability when we talk about resilience. I think it's helpful to talk about transition, the word, and it's really a change from one state to another state. And so for this example, I'm using the fact that we're now transitioning from what was a high energy and highly complex society, and we're headed towards a low energy, low complexity society. And transitions are difficult, especially in civilizations and communities. And so that's why transition really was formed. So I kind of stuck this one here. You'll think about this as I go through the peak oil piece of my presentation. All debt is borrowed against future supplies of affordable hydrocarbons. And when you think about debt and growing debt, if we have less and less supplies of affordable hydrocarbons, kind of makes you wonder how that debt would ever get paid back. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of walk through a few thoughts here. They kind of hang together. So you think about today's society, it is high energy and it is high complexity. And the whole thing is driven by our modern economy. So let's say the last 100 to 200 years has been this hydrocarbon fueled economy. In today's economy, probably starting in the 1920s-ish, when crude oil was really coming into vogue, it's the fuel of our economic engine. So if you think of the economy as an engine, crude oil literally is the fuel that drives that engine. And it's often referred to as the master resource. Credit and debt is the lubrication for that economic engine. So if crude oil powers it, if you don't have credit and debt in the system as we've defined it right now, the engine doesn't turn over, it seizes up. So think about that as we go through this presentation. And growth is an absolute imperative of our modern economy. There have been several times throughout the last century where growth has slowed down, and it's resulted in things like recessions and depressions. So it can be very disruptive if growth isn't constant and exponential in our economy. Okay, one of the core concepts that I started out thinking about energy 30 years ago because I could see issues with oil running out and what it would impact on our society. But it turns out, once you kind of peel back the onion, the energy, economy, and the environment are so intertwined, you can't actually separate them out right now. And unfortunately, the economic byproducts of our current economy are toxic to our ecosystem. I wanted to drive this point home, and a lot of the analysts that I follow would agree with this. Our global economy was really faltering and in trouble well before the pandemic struck. There were huge cracks that were being papered over by lots of money printing and debt. You think back to the 2008 crisis, and bailouts were happening, and then there was quantitative easing and easy money and all kinds of financial trickery going on. So the pandemic might be sold right now as the cause of a lot of misfortune in our economy. No, it was a catalyst or an accelerant. It wasn't the cause. And so one more point here, and sorry for the long list of things. Almost all the countries in the world right now have what's called fiat currency. And it's just basically paper money with a promise or the confidence of the public that it's worth something. Once upon a time, over periods of time, gold and silver might have backed that promise. So you could trade your paper in to a bank and actually get the hard metal back. That hasn't been the case for quite some time. I think 1971 or 2, Nixon took the US off what was left of the gold standard. So you can see there a little quote by Voltaire that paper money actually goes to zero, and that usually manifests itself in hyperinflation of some kind, or at least inflation. Okay, one more concept that I think is really crucial, and our culture, I'll say this is fairly common across most of the developed world, is humans are exceptional. And you'll see in the center box there, René Descartes articulated this idea probably the best, that humans are separate and superior to non-humans. In fact, humans are somehow separate and above the ecosystem that we live in. And then the other thing that's really been around for a long time, but really picked up steam in the last century, is this growth imperative. And we must grow, and at all costs. And you'll see the quotes around the edges here from world leaders, I'll call them leaders, over the last 50 years. Literally, we will go to any lengths to keep growth going. those two things are pretty problematic when you're on a finite planet. So, I think we need a paradigm shift, and a big one, and to cast aside this cultural narrative, which is going to be really hard because we've been swimming in it for all of our lives. And just a couple of notes here in that green box. There's either capitalism is put out there, as Margaret Thatcher says, that there's no alternative to communism, or to capitalism. Well, that's not true. If the alternatives, it's Marxist communism is pointed as the evil thing that is the only other alternative. Well, guess what? Those two things only emerged 300 years ago. And that's when the industrialization of the world started to take hold. Modern humans have been around for 300,000 years before that. They did okay. I mean, it wasn't the quality of life that we have now, that's for sure. But there are lots of different alternatives out there. So I'm just noting here, we could do worse than rediscover what our world's indigenous peoples had for cultural narratives. And we could also define our own going forward, knowing what we know today. Okay, so now to the transition movement, and it was founded in 2006, so 15 years ago, and Rob Hopkins constructed it as a response to a question why peak oil and climate change means small is inevitable. And we're going to dive into both of these core things, peak oil and climate change, just a second. Rob is a permaculturalist, so the transition movement is based on those principles, which is kind of refreshing. And if you want to take a look at Transition Guelph's principles, they are on our new website. So this movement, it quickly became a global movement, and transition towns and cities just popped up all over the place. And the core exercise or function of transition is to bring the community together and have a positive outlook on what could the future look like, and how do we strengthen our community resilience. So that's what drew me to the transition movement. It's not a protest group. It's to me, this is about building something new, and I love that. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this diagram, but when people say, so what do you mean by community resilience? I like to kind of talk about these 6 E's, and they're broad areas of you could focus on to work on resilience in your community. Transition Guelph tends to spend a lot of time at the base of this pyramid. Think of this kind of like a Maslow's hierarchy. We talk about ourselves as an environmental group, and gardening, urban gardening, is like a mainstay of the organization, and a lot of energy goes into that. But we always have an eye on all of these components, and when the right idea and project comes up, we will support it. Okay, so I've already mentioned this. The genesis of the transition movement was the twin drivers of climate change and the implications of peak oil. And I've already talked about the, smaller scale, less energy, less complexity. Okay, climate change. Now, there's only one slide on climate change in this presentation, but it's the first one because it's probably the risk that's our existential risk, and it's big. But you also notice that there's a whole whack of other things that are also crises, and they're all interlinked. So that's what all the different arrows are indicating. And literally everything in the biosphere that we rely on to thrive as a species is being eroded, threatened, poisoned, destroyed. So, climate change is certainly one of the biggest. It is the biggest, but all of these things are happening at the same time. And my brother Jim once said, "Our house is on fire," and it stuck with me. That it's true. I mean, we've got a serious problem right now. And I just kind of pondered the other day, did environmentalists miscalculate by focusing solely on climate change? Because there's so many other things that are going on at the same time. But hindsight's 2020. But I wanted everybody to appreciate that this is happening, all of these things. And you'll notice this spiral, and it's spiraling down. A number of these things, including especially climate change, are now kicking into what's called a reinforcing loop or positive feedback loop. And once you hit a tipping point, such as, the permafrost up north is starting to defrost, and it's releasing methane. Methane's it's I don't know, multiples worse than CO2. There's nothing humans can do to reverse that process once it kicks in, and that reinforcing loop is going to be even more problematic. Some recent discussions I've seen would say that we've talked about our CO2 budget as a planet, that it's probably now gone. And now we're on this wild ride. Okay, so hopefully that's helpful because all of these things are serious issues. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears now and talk about oil and the peak oil issue. Talked about it as the master resource, and it drives everything in our economy. So the food we eat, heating our homes, everything that needs to be transported, industry, on and on and on, and resource extraction. It permeates everything in our economy. So I get the question, or I hear it, will we run out of oil? And the answer is a little bit of a sleight of hand. Technically, no, there will always be oil in the ground. But in reality, for practical purposes, yes, we will run out of oil. And I've got a slide at the end. If anybody wants to drill into that question, I'd be happy to do that. But just kind of hold that thought, though, that for all practical purposes, we will run out of oil. And I've already said this, our modern economy demands growth or dies, and oil drives economic growth. Okay, so just to drive home this point, Gail Tverberg, Gail the actuary, she's got to be good, she's an actuary. She did this chart a while back, but I think it really helps to make the point that if you're looking at the blue line, which it goes like this, and that's oil consumed, and then the green line is GDP, so that's global GDP, that's gross domestic product. That's kind of our metric for economic output. You will see that anytime oil dips down, the GDP dips down. When oil rises, GDP rises. So Gail's making the point that oil is the economy in modern times. All right, so peak oil. There are a zillion of these types of charts out there. They call them the oil depletion curves. Conventional oil follows a very predictable pattern. Once you've discovered a field, it ramps up in production, and then at some point it peaks and you can't get any more out of that field than what you had at the peak, and it starts to decline. You will notice there's a bunch of different types of oil here. You know, the conventional is what you would normally see on land with that pump on it. Then you get into some harder to get stuff. NGL is natural gas liquids. So you actually take natural gas, compress it into a liquid. Over here, just in case someone's interested, this is giga barrels of oil equivalent per year. So giga is a billion. So say in 1965-ish, we consumed annually as a globe about 10 billion barrels of oil or equivalents. Okay, so that's to orient you. I apologize, almost every peak oil chart that I saw online only project or had actuals to about 2011, and then they were projections afterwards. So it's a little dated. This is a 2011 roughly graph. I've noted the US peak. So domestic US production peaked around 1973-4. For those of us who are actually around for that, that was an event. There were long lineups of angry customers at gas stations. Then they couldn't fill the cars, they couldn't move around. Prices of oil spiked. And it was around that time that OPEC kind of came into the picture, and they became what they call a swing producer, and were able to make up the difference between what the US oil, domestic oil industry could supply and what the US economy was demanding. Okay. The other thing, Christine, when she looked at this graph, she also noted that, interesting, it was about that time that all these other different colored things started to take hold. So hold that thought as well. All right, so because this graph stopped with actuals in 2011, it missed the so-called shale oil miracle in the US. So pardon the crude little triangle here. I just plopped that in to show that world production was kind of flat, but maybe slightly increasing during that shale oil miracle. But we are here. So we're at the precipice. A lot of the shale oil production in the US has shut down. The wells are depleting fast, and a lot of the companies are on the verge of bankruptcy. So I'll make a little side comment here. When I talked about money printing and papering over the cracks in our economy, here's a perfect example of it. The shale industry is just, they call it a miracle because the technology is just amazing, but it never made one nickel in profit in the entire time it was in operation. It survived because of almost zero interest loans available because of quantitative easing and other crazy low interest rate environment, and very loose lending standards. So they were able to borrow trillions of dollars, or billions of dollars to keep the industry afloat. And now it looks like the party's over. So we are here. So, the economy has this growth imperative, and this is a growth curve. It's crude. It's not intended to be accurate for global economy, just to give you an idea. But check it out. The economy, the global economy is expected to continue to grow, but oil supply is not there. So you say, uh-oh, this is a bit of a problem, right? Never before in the history of our oil-based economy have we ever faced this global problem. Okay, so I refer this as the Wiley Coyote moment. So he's chasing the roadrunner and then runs off the edge of a cliff, and he's suspended in air for a few seconds and coming to the realization that there's nothing under his feet. Okay, so why uh-oh? I've alluded to this early in the presentation. There's been a number of recessions and a fairly substantial depression in the last 100 years. And typically most of these things or some of these things happen during a recession or in a depression. It's not pretty. There's a lot of job losses. People can lose their savings through bank failures. There's foreclosures, so people are losing their homes. Supply disruptions, it could be shortages. I talk here about CapEx. That's capital expenditures, and industries, companies would tend to do research and development or do big projects using capital expenditures. The reason this is important in the oil industry is this is the money they spend to search out new oil supplies and develop them. There's been virtually no CapEx expenditures in the oil industry in the last, I'll say, 10 years, and might be 5 to 10 years. That kind of signals something significant. The oil companies are probably signaling that all the economically viable oil on the planet has been discovered, and they're not getting a price that's worth pursuing anymore. So in the last 100 years, if there was a recession or depression, we managed to bounce back to what you might call normal through a restarted economy and big increases in oil consumption. So that's usually what happens is, you get past that recession of 6 months and then you just get back on track and start that compound growth year over year again. And the same with the depression. It was actually in the 30s, one of the things that helped get out of the depression was, I believe it was work on the highway system in the US, interstate system. But it usually means a huge increase in oil consumption. Okay, so we're back to Gail Tverberg, and so this is fresh. This information here in this graph came from a presentation she did just a month or so ago. And actuaries not only like data, but they like to project out data. This is a shocking graph. So I want to clarify, she's saying this is world energy consumption out to 2050. It's not what's in the ground, and it's not, it's basically, it's not what's in the ground. It's what we are able to consume. It's way steeper down than I was expecting. I thought maybe it would follow the curve from, I'll just go back here to something more like this curve. because this is what's still in the ground that's probably viable to get out. So what she's saying here is that we're already seeing it. The economy's stalled. People are losing jobs. Consumers are tapped out on debt. Good jobs are disappearing. And this will just start to be one of those feedback loops where people can afford less. There's less consumerism. There's fewer things bought. More layoffs happen. And so on and so forth. So we'll be kind of dropping down in our economic activity fairly quickly. If Evan Ferrari was on the call, he would love this. She's measuring the energy consumption in exajoules. That's a lot of joules. I think that's like trillions or even a higher number than that. But the point is here, we're here. And then if you follow this curve down, so we're 2021, let's go to 2030 and just kind of go straight up here. That would imply that we would be consuming in 10 years less than half of what we're consuming now. That's amazing. So that goes to what Rob Hopkins was talking about, a society that's far less energy and by definition has to be far less complex. So the lesson in this is that our modern society, as wonderful as the benefits were and the economic engine that drives it, have run their course. And both are in the final phase as our resources deplete and the environmental devastation mounts. Isn't that a cheery thought? So yeah, we're on the precipice. In fact, last year might have been the first year of that whole process. So, oh my goodness, how's that going to impact me? When I say me, I mean everybody out there. So James Howard Kunstler wrote A Long Emergency. Is a great book, and it was quite prescient. But just the term, the long emergency, I think is quite descriptive. So we can expect economic collapse. The central bankers and others have done an amazing job, in a bad way, I think, of keeping the party going far longer than most experts thought. In fact, 2008 was the wake-up call. Most people thought the economic collapse was going to happen in about 5 years after that. Here we are 12 years, 13 years later. Disruptions and shortages. I think we're seeing those, right? Partly due to COVID, but like the whole fragile supply chain. Just 3 days ago, I think there was a mega ship that got caught in the Suez Canal and it's blocking traffic, and the price of oil is going up. Will we have a shortage from that? Maybe not, but the prices are certainly going up. Anybody who's written about collapsing societies talk about eroding social cohesion. It's one of the last things to erode, but underneath that, you've got mass unemployment, which, if measured properly, North America is probably pushing 20% unemployment rate right now. Extreme wealth inequality. Does that sound familiar? I thought I had a quote earlier and I probably skipped over it fairly quickly, but I think it was Plutarch 2000 years ago said that wealth inequality was one of the most fatal and ancient ailments of republics. A loss of faith of institutions, disappearing middle class, disappearing rights and freedoms. We've been pretty spoiled with rights and freedoms in the last 100 years. that might be at risk. And then finally, decreasing stability, and that's on a whole bunch of dimensions, as I say there. You can hear the war drums actually beating now more loudly globally than I can remember. I mean, China, Russia, US, Europe. There's a lot of stuff going on here, a lot of rhetoric that, yeah, I'm worried about that. And as shortages happen and all this other stuff's going on, we may see more pandemics show up because people might become less nourished or vulnerable, or healthcare could become less available. Okay, let's literally take a breath. It's heavy stuff. I suggest we all take a moment, stand up and stretch and breathe deeply. I'm going to do it. Kirsten, are you still with me?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Okay, awesome. Sometimes when you're talking like this, you think you might be all by yourself.
Well, we have 22 participants with us. Yeah.
That's terrific. All right, so yeah. Now let's talk about some positive visioning stuff. This is the transition stuff that I love. All right, so I'm going to start off, and Richard Heinberg, he was the keynote speaker 2 years ago from the Post-Carbon Institute. I love this talk, and his institute has really kind of looked at what level of, let's say, group size or government, quote, is optimal for making the changes that we need. And local is the spot. That's the sweet spot. You as a citizen at the local level actually can affect change. You can actually go and meet your counselors, talk to them. You can join organizations like Transition Guelph or Emerge Guelph, where a lot of NGOs out there that do great work in the community. You have agency. So this is where you can actually make things happen and feel ownership for it. And yeah, it's kind of the way we were as a species maybe 300 years ago, and before that. It's really kind of at the smaller level. The transition principle supports this. It's a principle of subsidiarity. So that really kind of goes to the decisions that affect people should be made at the level that's closest to those people impacted. And it's particularly powerful because if you've got people at the local level making decisions, they truly understand the unique requirements and resources and characteristics of the community to make a good informed decision. So if you're in Queen's Park and you're making a decision on something that impacts somebody in, I don't know, Mildmay, Ontario, or way up in Wawa, you're making one decision, and the context of those two communities might be completely different, and that one decision may be wrong for both. So I like that this principle, it really reinforces the idea that local is the sweet spot. All right, so I'm going to go through a few key things that I think you can do to help to build resilience, both personally, for your family, and for your community. And the first one is get healthy or stay healthy. And that includes physical, emotional, spiritual, and financial. If you're not healthy, you're not going to be able to be present. You're going to miss opportunities. you may not be able to actually do much more than just, be, which, there's less fortunate in the community that we need to support because of that. So try to be there and be healthy. Your whole outlook stems from that. And a lot of things that we kind of rely on, like pharma and the healthcare system, may not be there for us, or may not be in the form that we need. Okay, so get healthy. That's a good one. Secondly, the number one place that you I'll say waste energy, but consume energy is your home. And insulation is probably your best investment. If your house isn't currently at R40 walls and R60 attic, that's a good place to start. And I believe eMERGE does a home tune-up assessment. There may be others out there. So consider that, because think of Texas. So here's a community or a state that's wasn't expecting a weather event and crappy insulation. Now, not all of that is because of insulation, but to heat their homes, they were, trying to do it through, a lot of them through electricity. Electricity went out, their pipes burst, their homes were a mess, could have been loss of life. So this is a big one, and hopefully folks really think about this. And then there's a bunch of electricity hogs that can be in your house. We had no idea. In our house, we thought we were super efficient. The lighting under the kitchen cabinets, I had no idea how much power they were pulling. I thought they were LEDs. And we kept running our batteries out in the early morning on our solar system. We couldn't figure out why. And then we were just, by chance, noticed that those lights were just sucking things. So anyways, long story short, check it out. There's, desktop computers or gaming consoles, also horribly big on energy. So you might want to get rid of those or minimize them. Look to passively cool your home. I know we don't have any central air in our house. It's all passive. There's a couple of days in the year it gets a little warm in here, but it's it's a big drain on electrical consumption. Okay, move on to the next idea. So buy local. So this is really about our community and goes in the opposite direction of what globalism has been trying to do. So how do you support that? Well, first of all, look for the local independent retailers and get away from the big boxes. And there's cooperatives out there. They're brilliant. Use them. Think about using a credit union instead of a big bank, because credit unions usually are investing your savings into local projects. And, it's just a nice way to keep the dollars in the community. And where you can, this is tough these days because almost everything comes from China, but buy locally produced goods and services. Okay, so improve your food and water habits. Also a tough one to get people to change because it's convenience drives a lot of things, right? And cheap prices. So grocery store shopping is a wonderful habit for a lot of people and hard to break. It takes effort to go and find the things that you need that might be sold by a small market, and you might have to make a couple of trips to different places. But so buy local, healthy food. Uh, North Americans notoriously eat too much meat, so I'm not saying give it up, but reduce the meat consumption and search out those local organically raised farms. There's a number of them around. A Taste Real website here in Wellington County, great resource. So Taste Real, Wellington County, check that out. Grow your own food. There's lots of different ways of doing that. Store some of your food at home. So a well-stocked pantry, and if you have the spot in your basement, a cold room or a root cellar is fantastic. Quite a few of the organic farms around, they harvest lots of root vegetables, and then they store them over the winter in their own root cellars, like Ignatius Farm, and they're bursting at the seams. And it would be so much more helpful for them not to bear all that cost and have more distributed, smaller storage around the county. And of course, we're most vulnerable to food disruptions in the wintertime when we're not producing anything locally. And if the trucks stop running for even 2 or 3 days, the shelves empty out very quickly. Okay, I'm going to put a plug in for the Family Food Action Plan. So if you go to transitionguelph.org, there's a really nice document that kind of blows this out, unpacks it for lots of great ideas on how to, do any of these things. And get your kids involved. It's just fantastic. All right, this is a huge one, and you may or may not have heard about regenerative farming or ecological farming, but it's now being viewed as one of the top tactics, if you will, or strategies to combat climate change and getting carbon out of the atmosphere. So we can't do enough of this fast enough. We need to create demand for it, and we need to push for it. And not only climate change, but we're as a planet, we're losing topsoil at an alarming rate. And that's not just erosion, but we're poisoning the heck out of the I think call it a biome of the actual living organisms that are in the soil with all of the chemicals that we are throwing on conventional agriculture. So you can support this by buying local and ecologically grown foods. So that's ecologically is regenerative, organic, I think you call it natural production as well. And get your kids involved. I've said this before, take them to an eco farm and show them around. Also, university education may not pan out for the future because a low complex society doesn't have as much need for all kinds of professionals and office workers and things like that. So if you've got kids or grandkids that you think might be enjoying the gardening, getting into this farm, eco farming or regenerative farming could be a wonderful place for them. All right. Help rebalance equity. And oh, there's my Plutarch quote. I knew it was in here somewhere. So this guy he wrote this 2,000 years ago, and he says the oldest and most fatal ailment. So this is going back a long way to be observing this. We are on the verge of oligarchy and neo-feudalism. So what does that mean? It means that a very, very tiny majority of people assume, we'll call it leadership roles in the world. and there might be another 5% of the population that would become the bureaucracy that supports them. And then everybody else is basically a serf. And serfdom is not a fun place to be. You have practically nothing and are worked hard and are pushed around and whatnot. So I'm calling this neo-feudalism. You can see it on the horizon. We've got a bunch of billionaires who think they can run the world, and they could become the new aristocracy, and the rest of us are slowly losing our wealth, losing our jobs and whatnot. It's a very disturbing trend. So vote with your wallet against the wealth inequality. If there's a billionaire who owns something, don't do business with that something. Do business locally with somebody who's your neighbor, and keep the money in our economy and give them meaningful employment. We're going to need even more of food banks and community centers and charities that are helping are the less fortunate, because that group of people is growing rapidly. And you know, if we have a real economic break, which could happen in a month or a year or whatever, we're going to need a lot of support for folks. You know, it's motherhood and apple pie, but reject that business as usual politics. And that's kind of why I like transition, where we're nonpartisan, so we can kind of play outside the arena official politics, but we are a political organization and we can make stuff up, which is awesome. I'm going to make this observation. There's a lot of finger pointing these days, and it's really getting ugly in the mainstream media. In reality, it's a tiny minority of bad actors that are behind the intolerable inequality, and what they're doing is so complicated and covered in gobbledygook. Most people don't understand what's going on. But if there's any accountability to be had, it's these guys that should be held accountable. At the same time, please be generous and compassionate to everybody. Everyone's going through a tough time. COVID's making it worse, and temperatures are short. And yeah, just be good to folks. And then I'm gonna I think this is my last idea here. Contribute to the engaged economy, engaged community. So now is the time when we need to be together and sharing a common purpose to get through these tough days ahead of us. And I'm going to observe also that in a polarized world like we live in right now, the reality is we need a real balance of perspectives, people's dispositions, so savers versus spenders, or you know, risk averse versus risk takers. You could put different labels on it, and we're going to need a broad and diverse set of skills to make this transition. So this leads to refuse to participate in identity politics, stereotyping, and personal attacks. Man, it is just getting shrill out there, and it's not helpful. And I'm pointing my finger directly at both social media and major mainstream media as the culprits here. They're not the only, but they certainly are contributing to this. My puppy just ran in the room, so I had to pet her hair. Yeah, so quite honestly, Marie and I don't participate in social media for that very reason, and mainstream media is quite honestly, it was on its deathbed probably 5 years ago, and they hit on a wonderful business model of playing to a political base and all their fears and stoking anger, and they're making money again because people are not buying into it, but it's kind of a perverse form of entertainment, which I find abhorrent. So instead, get to know your neighbors, build some trust, find complementary skills in your neighborhood or in your community, get involved in some local organizations, talk to people, even if it's on the phone as opposed to texting or whatever. Humans are social creatures, and we absolutely need to have that social connection and build communities. We can't be fragmented and siloed. We have to come together as a community. And I'll put the caveat, do that in a socially responsible way for a pandemic. Looks like Genevieve O'Toole. All right, let her in. Okay, so my call to action for everybody is, so lead by example. You people who are listening, most of you get this, right? And I applaud you. So in a way, I'm preaching to the choir, but act on any and all the suggestions I've just put there. There's probably 200 times more suggestions out there that are also excellent. So be part of the solution, show some leadership, and be there for the community. It's always dicey to try and cajole friends and family to do stuff, but if you can nudge them in the right way and lead by example, maybe they'll catch on. Show enthusiasm for what you're doing, and don't feel badly if you're getting a little bit of maybe a little teasing or whatever. And help shape our future. So share your time, share your organizational skills, share your communication or storytelling skills. I think those are going to be really, and your leadership skills. So volunteer, and there's kind of a crass call for people to help with Transition Guelph. But if Transition Guelph isn't your gig, there are so many great nonprofits and charities out there that absolutely need this, especially the leadership and organizational skills. A lot of doers, but the people who are willing to organize and actually move projects and things forward, they are worth their weight in gold. So don't hide in the bushes. Okay, so yeah, that's the end of my prepared remarks, but seriously, be good in the sense of be a good community member and please be well. I wish both for you. Okay, Kirsten, I think we could probably slide into Q&A if we wanted to.
Okay, sounds good. I'm going to keep my video off just to keep things running smoothly. Great presentation, Steve. Thanks very much for walking us through all of that. There's a lot of concepts to unwrap there, so thank you for doing that.
Pleasure.
Okay, so there is something already in the chat, but I will encourage everyone here, if you have questions for Steve, please enter them into the chat, and then I'll unmute you when it's your turn and you can ask that question to Steve. So the first one is from Sharon Blom, and she
It's not from Sharon, it's Brian Scarrett.
Hey Brian, I knew it was you.
The question was about the shale. That's the part that threw me for a loop, that I didn't realize. Well, the question was, is this common knowledge that the whole shale industry is a bit of a sham, and that it doesn't seem to be. I didn't know that. That was completely fresh to me. They talk about energy independence in the States now.
Yeah, it's a great point. And Richard Heinberg and Art Berman in particular have been writing a fair bit, but I mean, if you're not aware of those two folks, then
I
you're
know
probably
that.
not hearing it because, sorry.
I knew about Heinberg, but I guess I missed that part about the shale somehow or another. Maybe I didn't want to hear it.
Yeah, well, and I think the impact will be felt fairly soon. Art Berman, who really knows what's going on in the oil industry, was saying that sometime in end of Q1 into Q2 this year, the impact of that industry basically collapsing will start to be felt. Now, the pandemic and
Waking up.
you know, might be masking the early parts of that. But
Great
thanks for your
presentation.
question.
It's a great presentation. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Brian.
Okay, great. So our next question is from Larry Moore. Larry, are you unmuted? Do you want to ask your own question? Let's see.
Yes, Steve, thank you very much. That was a wonderful presentation. And I know that you talked a lot about Guelph.
Larry,
We
how-
live in I'm sorry?
So I was going to say, how are things in Woodstock these days?
Woodstock is fantastic. Lots of volunteer opportunities. But how can we best help out with the Guelph area with some of the ideas that you come up with, or locally here in Woodstock?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, if there are volunteer opportunities in Woodstock, and that, you know, maybe a platform to push some of these ideas forward into your community. If you were predisposed to creating a small transition town chapter, there's lots of supports for that as well. What I find too, and I think you're a great educator, so there's usually an appetite to with local media to run some articles. So if you write something about these concepts and you to say, how can I get in on this? So just a couple of ideas there.
Hi, Steve. I think it might be breaking up a little bit. I'm not sure for everyone else, but Larry seemed to give you a thumbs up for that one. So I guess his question was answered.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. So next, I have a question from Lindsay. Lindsay, are you unmuted? Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thanks very much for the presentation. I was just wondering if you had a resource, like a local resource, like a list or database for being able to buy local groceries or like butchers or household needs, that sort of thing. It looks like maybe you've already posted it in the chat, but that's
Yeah.
I posted Taste Real in the chat.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, that would be my go-to for sure. Yeah.
Sorry, I think I have a bad.
Ask the question.
Let's see. Lindsay, were you breaking up or did you get what you were looking for?
Yes, it was just silent there for a moment, so I wasn't sure if anyone was speaking and I just couldn't hear. Sorry.
Okay. I think Steve was suggesting the Taste Real is a great resource. I've posted it in the chat. Hopefully that link works. Let me know if it doesn't.
Great. Thank you very much.
Okay, does anyone else have any questions they'd like to ask Steve?
Well, while we're waiting, I'm going to just touch on that question. Will we run out of oil? And I said that the theoretical answer is no, we won't. But
yeah, we just have to do that part.
the practical.
Oh, someone is, I'm gonna mute a few people here. All right, you're good to go, Steve.
Okay, so yeah, this slide here has a few things on it. So the story of oil, when it first was discovered in the U.S., you can see a little tongue-in-cheek there, but you could stick a little hole in the ground, and all of a sudden this oil would gush out under huge pressure. And you have to get some way to collect it up and cart it off to wherever. And if you look at the graph on the far left, US domestic oil in 1930, for every barrel of oil of energy you put into the oil industry, you received 100 barrels of oil back. That's a pretty good investment. So 1 to 100. Now, if you fast forward to 1970, you see that that ratio had dropped significantly to less than half under the most favorable measure, and possibly to only 20%, somewhere in between 20 and 40%. That's because the oil is no longer coming out as a gusher under its own pressure. You actually have to coax it out of the ground. And this is roughly when oil was peaking in the US. So then you go over here to 2000, and it's now returning. 1 barrel of oil of energy only returns about, let's say, 10 to 15. So this is a typical decline in the ease of getting the remaining oil out of the ground. At some point, whatever's left in the ground is so hard to get, it's not worth getting. So, look at the image on the right, and that's our tar sands in Alberta. And how crazy is it that we go to these lengths with these massive pieces of equipment, and the energy it takes to separate the sand and the actual tar or oil is just unbelievable. And so this kind of thing is not sustainable long term. Plus the environmental destruction that goes with this, just it's off the scale. So that's why you can say, yeah, there's going to be oil in the ground till the cows come home. I mean, it could be for millions of years, but it's not going to, at some point, it's not going to be worth going after. And Gail Tverberg, in probably around 2008 or so, when she was still writing with the Oil Drum website, it was brilliant work, by the way. And she said, when we hit peak oil, we won't notice a big drop off or anything. It'll be this kind of bouncing economy, because we're going to hit a point when the cost of pulling out the remaining oil is too expensive for the economy to like, but not expensive enough for the oil companies to remain profitable. And so sure enough, the last, let's say 10 years, we've seen this up and down in terms of prices or whatever, and our economy in fits and starts just can't seem to get going, and then it falls back. And that's this phenomenon, is that the easy to get, really nice stuff, they could call it tasty oil or whatever, which I don't know how you come up with that. It's gone. And what's remaining is the tougher to get that stuff, and less economical. So that's the reason why we will always have oil, but it won't be accessible to us. And to Brian's point on the shale, think of the amazing technology required to get 3 years worth of oil out of rock, bedrock, and or shale rock. And
Okay, Steve, I might interrupt you to get into a couple more questions.
Sure.
Okay, Sharon Blom, or actually Steve Delamonte, do you allow visits or do tours of Coyote Hollow Farms?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, we love to have people come out, and usually during the say June through October, we have a little roadside stand and people drop in all the time. But if you are interested, you can just email Coyote Hollow Farms, all one word, at explorenet.ca. And you can arrange to come out, or you could just pop out. We're usually around once in a while. We're out and about. We'd love to see you.
Thanks, Steve. Sharon Blom asked, is this recording of Steve's presentation available? It will be available probably a week or so after the Resilience Festival wraps up. We'll be updating our Resilience Festival website, and the recording, which will be a YouTube link, will be on there. Okay, Larry Moore asked, Larry Moore said he would like to send this recording to his children. So there you go, Steve, it will live on.
Awesome, thanks, Larry.
Peter Gill, you say oil has been the engine of our economy. What is the potential for alternative energies to replace oil, i.e. solar?
Yeah, this is going to be hotly debated and has been for a while. I'll be blunt. I think that oil, when it's gone, there is no substitute for it for many, many things. Alternatives will help us bridge to for probably a couple of decades, but electricity with renewables is intermittent. Storage of that energy is it's hugely problematic, and a lot of things that we rely for oil can't be done with electricity, and there's I'd like to think that we figure that out. Yeah, I'm not hanging my hat on that one. So I'm hoping for the best, but I'm preparing for the worst. Let's put it that way. Especially gasoline, it is almost the perfect energy source, aside from the carbon emissions and whatnot, but it's easy to transport. It's high density of energy, and it's stable. So it was probably a once in a planet history's endowment of energy that we'll never see again. And unless somebody magically figures out something like fusion reactors or thorium reactors, I've heard, but that's decades away, and our problem is now. And how do we feed a planet and keep people warm in that? So I just don't hold any hope out.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Does anyone else have any questions for Steve? You can type it into the chat. Sorry, Steve, I'm not sure if I interrupted your chat before. It was kind of breaking in and out, so I thought I might have come in at a break, but I'm sorry if I didn't.
No, that's fine. I think I told the story. Hopefully people heard it.
Yeah. All right. Well, I don't have any more questions coming in. How do you feel if we wrap it up?
That sounds good.
Okay.
It's been I think it's been an hour and almost a half of this kind of heavy stuff. That's terrific. You guys hung in there. I appreciate it.
Well, Steve, I want to thank you for generously sharing your knowledge, your passion, and your time with our community. We're very grateful to have folks like you helping to strengthen our local resilience. And if people have more questions for you, how would you like them to get in touch with you?
I can email info@transitionguelph.org, and that will get to me. That's probably the easiest way for folks.
Okay, I've put that into the chat for
Yeah.
folks. Oh, Sally did have one last question, it looks like. I'll read it out. For renewables to support an economy, the levels of manufacture, tech, and consumption need to match the supplies. There can still be energy, just not at the nut-sea levels we have been used to.
Yeah, that's a great point. I was probably a little over pessimistic. You know, things like hydroelectric will continue on for quite a long time, and we may need to come to grips as a society on where do we deploy it. And so it might be a little bit of lighting and a little bit of industry. It'll be likely rational or highly prioritized, but I don't think we're going to go into a complete dark age either. Thanks, Sally.
There's a lot of thanks coming in. Thanks to TG volunteers and for making the Resilience Festival happen. And thanks, Steve, for a great presentation.
Thanks, guys. I enjoyed myself.
I'm going to stop the recording now.